Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and getting better every single day. And thanks to all of you and your incredible encouraging comments. So let's get started with part 2 of our story. Love to each and every one of you. If you haven't heard part 1, definitely click on the description because you don't want to miss it, because it all leads to a very exciting Bigfoot encounter. So let's get started with part 2 of our story. "What are we going to do with Rebel's body?" Hugh asked. "Maybe we should take it back to where Ken ran it over," Sheila suggested. "I think we should bury it," said Jackson, "in a wood grove somewhere around here. We would never be seen. There isn't a living soul around here for many miles. It's not such a bad place to end up being buried in a woods. Put it this way, in a normal cemetery, someone like this, well, his grave is going to be vandalized in sheer disgust by people who know who he is. Unless, of course, his family chooses to cremate him." "What about the money in the duffel bag?" asked Jackson. "Do we bury it with him?" "It's ill-gotten gain," said Kevin. "I think we should divide it between the 7 of us." "No," I said. "This money probably belongs to a sweet old dear somewhere. Maybe this rebel killed her recently with that knife. You know what old people can be like. They often don't trust the banks. My great-grandmother was like that. Supposing a little old dear hid the money in her house and Rebel slit her throat for it. If she's alive, we need to get this money back to her, and even if she isn't, to her next of kin. I'm quite sure we'll find a newspaper report about a robbery involving an old lady who was stabbed for her money." "That's a good idea, Dee. I don't want blood money on my hands. Someone might have died because of this money." We all agreed that we wanted nothing to do with the filthy money. It was clearly contaminated with the virus of a great evil. We decided to go to sleep, as we were weighed down with absolute exhaustion. We parked Ken's car in the garage and decided that the following night we would bury the body. We had time on our side, as we were quite literally in the middle of nowhere, and running into a single living soul was unlikely to ever happen. The garage was sufficiently cool. We were sure the body would not start smelling straight away. Hugh informed us that there was a sizable collection of spades in the yard shed. We could use those to dispose of the body. We could even send an anonymous letter to the police at a later date to tell them where the body of Rebel could actually be found, for the sake of his family. In truth, we had no sympathy for the dead body. Now we knew who the man actually was. For why should we concern ourselves with a vindictive man that's only repugnant, vile contribution to society had been scaring little old ladies half to death, and slitting their throats most probably, while absconding with their life savings? The following morning I woke up with a start. The events of the previous evening were so ambiguously vague in my mind. I was certain it had been an illusory dream, that had been alarmingly realistic in so many regards, and for a brief moment I certainly believed it was just that. But when I rubbed the cobwebs of sleep away from my eyes, then I remembered that my dream had been anything but. A nauseous feeling washed at the back of my throat, with a bitter aftertaste, when I remembered there was indeed a deceased corpse in Ken's truck, hidden inside the garage. The thought left me feeling quite biliously sick. Somehow this birthday bash we'd all been looking greatly forward to had lost its rosy glow. The cottage Hugh had booked for his 25th birthday was a charming, quaint and quirky affair, with a crooked chimney and a wild front yard, filled with all kinds of perennial flowers, tangled together in a charming, colourful kaleidoscope of organised chaos. The elegant interiors of this really charming cottage were kitted out luxuriously, with every modern convenience you could possibly think of, while still maintaining its whimsical fairy tale-like integrity. I knew that with a body to bury in the evening, this was going to be a birthday we would be unlikely to ever forget, and the secrets of what was to transpire tonight we would likely carry with us to our graves. Of course I was annoyed that Ken had been drinking. He should have known better than to drink and drive, because he was half cut. But I didn't want him to go to prison for a thug like this. No one deserved that. If the man he had mowed down had been a decent member of society, it would have been an entirely different matter. There was no way any of us could dob our friend into the authorities. That would be, to our reasoning, a very unethical thing to do in the circumstances. I put my dressing gown on, tying the velvety rope around my middle, as I descended the stairs with my tousled hair standing up on end. The cottage was steeped in silence, apart from a low snoring sound that I heard coming from the living room. Poor old Ken, he hadn't even managed to get to his bedroom last night, but was still lying fast asleep with a duvet flung over his body. He was caught up in the world of his dreams, but with the curtains all drawn in the living room, the house seemed incredibly dark. When I finally entered the kitchen, the bright morning sunlight trespassed eagerly through the wide French windows. I glanced up at the clock on the wall. It was 12:30 in the morning. You've got to be kidding me. Everybody was still fast asleep. I decided I'd prepare a brunch, and slowly my friends began to wake up one by one. As I imagined, the delectable smell of bacon and sausages had aroused their sleeping bodies out of their slumber. Nobody had bothered to dress, as we all gathered around the kitchen table, in our pyjamas and dressing gowns, drinking orange juice and diving into our breakfast hungrily. Ken still remained fast asleep in the living room on the couch. I think he didn't want to wake up to the grim reality that the previous night he had been responsible for killing a man. It was better to be swept away in the illusional world of dreams, where nothing ever matters. All you could hear in the kitchen was the sound of cutlery, clinking and clattering. We ate in silence, none of us saying a single word, as we all basked in the discomfort of the previous night's memories that had rudely come flooding back into all of our minds, like a fortuitous tsunami of chaos that we would soon have to sort out. We all looked at each other in horror when we heard the whooshing sound of a car driving down the long driveway, its rubber tires pounding the gravel. We were certainly not expecting a visitor, especially out here without a living soul around for many miles. "Bloody hell," said Hugh, his back straightening, his chin tightening. "Who the hell is this? We're not expecting anyone." "I'll get it," I said. "Don't say a thing about you know what," Hugh called after me. I felt a tad annoyed with Hugh, that he might think I would betray the trust of my close friends. When I opened the front door, I noticed a policeman climbing out of his vehicle. My heart began to leap in my chest like a frog darting from one water lily to another. What was a policeman doing here, I wondered? Did he know we were hiding a dead body in the garage? Did he know what Ken had done? I tried not to tremble in my velvety slippers as the officer approached me with a large, warm, friendly smile on his face. He lifted his cowboy hat from his head and gave me a nod. "Sorry to disturb you, ma'am. I thought I would check on the Kordinsky house for a moment, in case anyone was here." "We are here for a weekend break. It's our friend's 25th birthday," I explained. "I see. So how many of you are actually here?" "There are about 7 of us," I said. I tried to straighten my ruffled appearance, self-consciously aware that I looked rather bedraggled. "I'm sorry, officer. We're all in our pyjamas, I'm afraid. So late in the day." "Don't apologize to me. I take it you've had quite a party last night, then. Is that why you woke up this late in the morning?" "Something like that." "Good for you. Well, you're very lucky," he said, giving me a wink. "No one out here will hear your music or happy shrieks, as your nearest neighbours are several miles away from here. Perfect place for a party, you could say." "Can I help you, officer?" I asked inquiringly. The officer looked rather uncomfortable. "I don't want to alarm you," he said, pulling out his cell phone and showing me a picture of the deceased man lying in the back of Ken's trunk. "Have you by any chance seen this man around? His name is Rebel Walter Riley." I can't say I have." My face guiltily brushed a crimson colour, but I managed to pretend to examine the picture more closely. It was definitely of the deceased man in the back of Rebel's truck. No, I haven't seen him, officer. Who is he?" The officer ran his hand through his mane of brown curls. "Look, I don't want to cause you any undue alarm, but this man is wanted by the police. He is dangerous, volatile, very unhinged." "What makes you think he'd be around here, officer?" I asked obsequiously. "I mean, there's nothing going on in this part of the world, is there?" "There has been a sighting of him in these parts very recently. Someone reported having seen a man fitting his profile on America's Most Wanted. I'm just dropping around homesteads in the area to warn people about this man, in case he should subsequently cross their path. Don't under any circumstances invite this man into your home or offer him a lift if you should see him. Just give me a call. He is capable of anything. It would make sense for him to hide out in a remote area like this. And I'm afraid an insidious crime that happened not far from here fits with his profile of previous things we believe the man has done. What has he done, officer? Please tell me. I need to know. I don't want to alarm you, ma'am, but there is an old lady who lives not too far from this location. Well, far enough, but as close as you can get in this part of the world. Her name is Francine Derbury. Lovely old dear she is. Her daughter Jessica has been trying to get her to move for years, but the stubborn old mule enjoys her hermetic existence. The night before last, we believe Revel broke into her house, stole the equivalent of $80,000 from under the woman's bed. He stabbed her in the chest. Luckily, he missed her heart. She is now thankfully recuperating in hospital and doing very well indeed. The prognosis is excellent. Thankfully, she managed to call for help before she passed out. The police officer shrugged his shoulders. Men like Rebel. They need a knife in their guts. Honestly, preying on old people like that. There was no need to stab that old woman. At the very least, he could have just absconded with her money. But stabbing her like that, it makes me sick. The vulnerable in our society. Anyway, we're pretty convinced that Rebel is behind this attack. What a coward. The sooner that thug is behind bars, the better as far as I'm concerned. This time I hope they lock him up and throw away the key. That's dreadful, quite dreadful. Do you think the police will ever find him? Frankly, I hope he drops down dead first. There's way too much evil in this world of ours. Even his own family want nothing more to do with him. I've been informed he attacked his own mother once, left her in a pool of her own blood when he was 18 years old. But she refused to give him any money. That's why he stabbed her. That's appalling. Well, I just needed to warn you, said the officer. Give us a call if you see a man fitting his description. I will indeed, officer, I assured him. My guess is that karma will eventually catch up with him. Well, I hope you're right, miss, he said, lifting up his cowboy hat and giving me a friendly nod. I watched him as he got back into his police vehicle and drove away. In truth, I wondered how he would have reacted if I'd shown him Rebel's deceased body. He'd have probably been as pleased as Punch, but that would mean Ken would be in the firing line, along with the rest of us for being complicit in covering up this accident. What was all that about? My friends asked me when I returned to the kitchen. It was the police, I told them. Someone saw Rebel's profile on America's Most Wanted. They swore they'd seen him in these parts. The officer was warning us that he's dangerous and to watch out for him. And get this, he tried to murder an old woman who doesn't live too far away from us. Well, several miles back, obviously. He stabbed her in the chest, narrowly missing her heart. It must have been her dried blood that we saw on the knife, and her money we found in the duffel bag. The good news is she's making a full recovery in hospital. $80,000 he took of her savings, which I shall be taking back to her when I pay her a visit. But before we worry about that, we need to get rid of Rebel's body. And by the sounds of things, he's not going to be missed by a living soul. Not even his own mother, who he left for dead at 18 years old on her own bathroom floor. She refused to give him any money. That's why he stabbed her. Even though she wanted nothing to do with him, she refused to file charges against him, given he was her son. More's the pity, if you ask me. He should have been locked up for good a long time ago, and then none of this stuff would have happened. The night of the burial, Hugh's account. I'd been looking so forward to my 25th birthday bash. And then this had to happen, to throw a spanner in the works. Even when I'd booked the cottage for my birthday weekend, I had a funny, inauspicious feeling that things would go badly wrong. When Ken was running late for the barbecue dinner I had prepared on Friday night, a sense of foreboding curled up in my stomach, like a snake in a bathtub. I just knew that something was off. The truth is, if anyone was going to let us down, I would put my money on the fact that it would be Ken. Growing up, Ken was always the one landing us into a heap of trouble, the one who accidentally threw the ball into the neighbour's window, shattering the glass and narrowly missing the cat lying on the sofa, the one who mistook Mrs. Dwendaline's store cupboard for a toilet and peed in a bowl of her marinating salmon, which he mistook for an open toilet, which caused her no end of grievous upset. So in the end she had to give the salmon to her dogs, who didn't mind at all that it had been peed on. So if anyone was going to knock someone over on the road, my money would almost certainly have been on Ken. That is, if I was a betting man. When someone you care about has done something bad, it's a natural human instinct to protect them. But sometimes it might be in their best interest to face the consequences of what they've done. Ken had always been a likeable dude, without a nasty bone in his body. So it was most unfortunate that he had killed someone on the road like this. But when we discovered he'd actually mown down a villain, wanted for a grievous murder, our sympathy for the deceased man waned like the smoke from a chimney. Let's just say his thought would likely become the ashes at the crematorium that no one remembered to pick up, or the tombstone that ended up being covered in red swastikas. We actually thought we were doing him a favour burying him peacefully in an enchanting woodgrove. Not that he deserved to rest in such a peaceful place. We would give him still a dignified send-off, say a few prayers, and that would be that. We would hope that for eternity he would not be burning in the fires of hell, based on what he'd done. I doubt the man had any remorse, as he lay there on a remote country road, breathing his very last. I was not afraid that we would be caught digging a grave for this man in the woodgrove, as there rarely were no people for miles around, apart from fields, meadows, and ubiquitous trees that stretched out to an eternity. Somehow the stigma of what we were doing did leave a nasty taste in my mouth. I don't think any of us were feeling good about this. We had wisely decided to leave Ken out of the burial. He was so traumatized by what he'd done that I was worried he was becoming suicidal. We were in fear he would do something to himself. We reasoned with him that the man he'd run over was evil, and that in a twist of fate he had possibly done the world a good service, although it did not at all excuse his drink driving by any manner of means, because he could have harmed an honourable American citizen. "If that were the case," said Ken reflectively, "I would definitely hand myself in to the police." "Don't you see, Ken," I told him, "that man left an old woman for dead in her home, stealing her life savings, $80,000. There was no need for him to stab her, but he did, which in my book makes him a monster. If this was your grandmother, you'd probably kill the dude and feel no remorse whatsoever." Our words seemed to comfort Ken, but he told us, "I promise you, I'm never going to drink again." I thought that was a shock talking at the time, but I kid you not, Ken went completely cold turkey and never touched a drop of alcohol ever again. I asked him once how he'd given it up. "I just have to remember what I did on that country road," he told me, "and I associate it with the taste of that beer, and drinking it has become completely repugnant to me." We left Ken at the cottage, and the 6 of us piled into my 4-wheel drive. It was a bit of a tight squeeze, I have to admit, but the more hands on deck this evening, the better. We were not worried about being seen, as it was unlikely we'd see a human for many miles. We placed the dead body on a plastic canvas in the back of my trunk over piles and piles of newspaper. We had also made sure that Ken's car had been thoroughly cleaned, so no drops of blood could ever be detected. We put 4 large spades in the back of the trunk. There was an open woodland trail, not too far from the property, which seemed like an excellent place for us to bury the body. We managed to park my SUV in an obscure place, so it was well hidden from the road. But such savvy precautions were most likely unnecessary, but you could never be too careful. Of course, I didn't feel good about burying a body in the woods like this, so that the bones might never be recovered. But we had a plan, so that should the authorities ever need to dig up the body of Rebel, we would lead them straight to the location. We would wait an entire year and then send the police anonymous note, claiming that Rebel had been killed accidentally and giving them the direct location of the body, that we would bury under a tree covered in yellow bandages so that it would be easy for them to discover the place. I knew that there was no way that good old Ken should go to prison for mowing down this man, whom frankly was one of the cockroaches in our society, and truly I had little empathy for his plight. It was as Sheila had so eloquently put it. Karma had finally caught up with him. The night was dark and intimidating. The moonshine was pitiful and unkind, sparing us little illumination. But we plodded along, refusing to be intimidated. Our primary focus was on getting this job done as efficiently and as quickly as we could. I regret to say that despite harbouring the body in the cold garage, it had begun to smell rather unpleasant, a sickly sweet smell. It was already starting to decompose, but we were all covering our noses as we pulled the canvas top out of the trunk. Sheila and Dee led the way with the torch, while the 3 men carried the top together, and one of the men carried the trowels. Let me tell you, a dead weight is a great deal heavier than a living one, but with 4 men to carry the body, it really wasn't an issue at all, although the ground was uneven and hilly. Once we were in the woods, it became significantly darker, as the trees clustered together so tightly that they stole the moonlight by blocking the canopy, so that no silvery prisms of light could trespass through the branches, which was an awful pity. The tall, lofty, majestic trees in the woodgrove swished their foliage so that the leaves rustled and a cool breeze nuzzled our faces. We could hear strange, haunting, airy wails coming from inside the forest that really made both Dee and Sheila very much on edge. I was not much worse for wear myself. The forest felt inauspicious, even with the reassuring songs of crickets and frogs trilling through the night, but their cheerful, encouraging chorus did little to ease my trepidation. By all accounts, in this perfect woodland oasis, we had the profound, instinctive sense we should not be here, as if in some way the night hours were not reserved for the likes of us, and we had poached impertinently onto territory that was not ours to impose upon. We trailed awkwardly across fallen leaves and small twigs. The crunching sound of our boots on this loose bracken was a little unsettling, for it annoyingly betrayed our presence to any nighttime animals, which may have been a good thing in retrospect. It did not help that on occasion the branches would brush up against us, almost as if disembodied hands were grabbing us at will, while the cruel ground beneath our feet was spitefully uneven, as gnarled branches like ugly hands angrily jutted out of the earthen soil, their tentacle-like knots determined to ensnare our unsuspecting feet. But we did not succumb to their trickery. Luckily, the powerful lights from our head torches meant we were not ensnared by any of their vindictive earthly traps. Soon we found the perfect spot where to bury the body, and Jackson removed a thick pile of yellow bandages, which he wound tightly around the trunk of the tree, to mark the exact location of the grave. "Right," I said. "Let's start digging here." Everybody agreed. I thought the task would be relatively easy, but I couldn't have been more mistaken. The ground was hard and unyielding. The digging was a slow, arduous process. We groaned with exhaustion. Digging this grave was back-breaking work, and our unapologetic foreheads broke out in a hot sweat that streamed down our faces like warm tears. Something that I thought would be relatively straightforward was a nightmare, especially when our trowels were greeted by hostile roots that spread out their vast tentacles through the soil in a web of frustrating knobbly knots and curls. It was while we were digging I was overcome with the profound sense that something or someone was watching us. I was sure I'd seen a strange movement behind the trees, a dark, ominous shadow, a flash of bright yellow eyes, shining from about 7 foot off the ground. But no one else appeared to notice a thing, so I firmly told myself I must have imagined what I'd seen. The yellow eyes could easily have been an owl's. Dee did validate my gut instincts when she suddenly said at one point of the digging, "Something is watching us! I know something is watching us! Someone is here!" Her eyes grew round with anxiety. Jackson teased her. "The woods, they're watching us," he teased. "Has no one ever told you, Dee, that trees actually have eyes?" "That's not funny, Jackson," said Dee, not very impressed with his joke. "Get a grip," Jackson told her. "You're seeing things that are not there, Dee." "I'm not imagining things, Jackson. I promise you I'm not," she chided gingerly. "I'm telling you, something is there." "Oh, for goodness sake, Dee. You're just seeing shadows. That's what it is," said Jackson, smirking. My heart sank, for I knew that Dee was right. I could not see a single sign of a living soul around, but the clawing feeling that were being watched clung to me like a silken spider web that I could not shake off. I was certain the entire time that someone was there. I'm glad to say that our doggedly determined digging paid off, as the heaving, reluctant ground began to open up for us like a wide, sizable yawn, and soon we had successfully prepared a deep grave for the deceased body. We rolled Rebel into his grave until his body hit the bottom with a mighty plop, like a stone that you would fling into the water. We covered his body with a plethora of soil, sighing with relief for a job well done. The relief I felt was monumental. We stamped the soles of our boots over the topsoil to make it appear as tightly undisturbed as possible. Some of us sat near the grave to recover our breaths, as exhaustion had drained our bodies of their energy. We were also feeling desperately thirsty. "I'm going to look for some wild flowers," said Dee. "What the hell?" asked Jackson. "You're kidding, right?" He looked at Dee as if she had lost leave of her senses. "What the hell would you want to do that for?" Dee indignantly put her hands on her hips and glared fiercely at Jackson. "This man is dead. We have just buried him. I admit he was wicked in life, but does he not deserve our prayers? It would be horrendous not to give him some kind of a send-off into the next world." Jackson shook his head in frustration. "Woman, I'll never be able to understand them. It's ridiculous to be looking for flowers at this time of night." "I've got a hand torch in my pocket," said Dee, pulling out a slimline torch from her pocket. "I've seen some flowery stuff on the edge of the woods." "You have to put flowers on a grave," she insisted. "Everybody knows that." "I will go with her," I said. Jackson rolled his eyes. "Are you kidding me, Hugh? You're a real soft touch." "Look," I said, "if Dee feels happier about us putting flowers on this man's grave, we will do that." "Humour her, you mean," said Jackson scathingly. "It's pathetic, Hugh, if you don't mind my saying." "I don't think we should worry about flowers," said Tyson, interceding. "The idea is absolutely ridiculous. I've never heard anything so pathetic in all my life. Don't you think we should get the hell out of here? We've dug the grave, now we should go." "We're not going anywhere," Dee growled. "Not until I've got the flowers and we've said a couple of prayers for the man. That's the least we could do in the circumstances." Dee's account. While we were digging the grave in the woodgrove, I absolutely knew with complete conviction that someone was watching us. Of course, when I expressed my reservations, Jackson made fun of me, belittling my concerns by reassuring me that trees all have eyes. He laughed hysterically at his own joke. Jackson rarely could have the hide of a rhino at times and the sensitivity of a gnat. He was not very intuitive, and I think from when I was a little girl he always thought I was a sissy, and told me as much when I was 8 years old. I still remember him saying, "Dee, you're a big baby," when I cried because I had heard Mrs. Hilton's dog Felix had died, and that dog had been very special to me. I knew Jackson would never ever understand me. I gritted my teeth and continued to help with the digging. It was back-breaking work, and Jackson kept giving me a pitiful look as if to say, "Why are you even bothering? Your attempts to dig are pathetic and futile." Of course, when I finally suggested in getting some flowers for the grave, Jackson looked at me as if I was the Mad Hatter in Alice in Wonderland. He shook his head at me, exclaiming that he never understood women. "For God's sake, Dee, we don't need flowers on this man's grave." I was so angry with Jackson. He made my blood boil. How could he be so indifferent? Yes, I knew the man we had buried was evil, but that did not mean he didn't deserve a wee bit of dignity in his death, and most of us were too exhausted to say anything once the grave was actually dug. As Bottoms gratefully hugged the ground, and furious breathing began to be stilled, I was ever grateful to Hugh. Ever since we were kids, I could always rely on him to be the sensitive one, and on this occasion he was no different. He said he thought it was a lovely idea to put flowers on Rebel's grave. I knew the flowers would ultimately die, but it was the thought that counts. I was grateful that Hugh had agreed to come with me in search for the flowers, while the rest of the group regained their strength. Me and Hugh began walking towards an open clearing that led to a pretty alpine meadow. At night most of the flowers had closed their heads, but I didn't care about that. We needed some flowers to grace the grave, and Hugh helped me fumble around clumsily in the darkness for some flowers, and that was when we saw him. I knew he was young because he almost skipped towards us with a joyful ebullience, carrying in his hands huge handfuls of alpine flowers, and handing them eagerly over to me. Hugh and I were staring bewildered at this creature. We realized at once he was a Bigfoot. I was shocked when the creature thrust the flowers into my hand. It was like he wanted me to be pleased. He wanted me to be happy. I was equally as confounded as I was completely touched by the kind gesture, that for a moment my tongue seemed to be tied up in knots, and I was unable to speak for a moment. "Thank you," I said when I finally found my words. "That's very kind of you. They're very pretty." The Bigfoot was easily 7.5 foot tall, and built very powerfully, but I knew it was still a youngling, probably not even a teenager yet. I think the thing that startled me the most was his human-like face that was incredibly expressive. The Bigfoot then went rushing back to grab me more flowers from the field, and me and Hugh began to laugh at his incredible ebullience. The more I said thank you to him, the more he rushed off to get yet more flowers. He was the sweetest creature I've ever seen. I patted him on the back and told him how kind he was. He smiled back at me through the most beautiful eyes I've ever seen. Moments later, I saw a large, lofty silhouette standing by a tree, and then I heard a distinctive whistle. The Bigfoot's eyes looked sad, almost sorrowful, and I heard in my head the very distinctive words, "I've got to go. It's my mum. I hope you've got enough flowers for the grave." And then he nodded and ran briskly towards the trees. We saw the two silhouettes, standing there for a moment, watching us from a distance, and then they disappeared. "My God," said Hugh, "I can't believe that's just happened. It feels so surreal. We've just seen a Bigfoot, for goodness sake. And that thing was the sweetest creature I've ever seen." "Hugh, did you see how sweet he was? How kind and how generous? Oh, my word! He had a heart of pure gold." "We better not tell the others what we've seen," Hugh warned me. "Jackson will make fun of you, you can be sure of that." The little Bigfoot had given me so many alpine flowers that it was almost impossible to carry them all. And Hugh and me returned to the grave with what looked like haystacks of foliage. I had to bring it all to the grave, as that little Bigfoot would have been really offended otherwise. But I did notice the wide eyes of my friends gawking at the monumental stack of flowers that were placed on the grave, that were given to us by a very thoughtful Bigfoot, but they had no way of knowing that, and I was never ever going to tell them. I knew everyone must have thought I was a little cuckoo, but I did not care. I had encountered an incredible creature tonight, and I couldn't have been happier about that. Finally we said some prayers for Rebel, and left the gravesite feeling heartily relieved, and hoping with all our hearts we would never have to think about this matter again. 2 days later, the nurse led me to see the old lady, Mrs. Francine Burberry, who was propped up in her bed, surprised to learn that she had a visitor. "Sorry, my dear, but I don't know who you are," she asked me, looking at me through her warm blue eyes. "But I'm very delighted to have a visitor nevertheless." "Are those for me?" she said, staring at the large vase of roses that I'd brought her, which I placed on her nightstand. "How very kind of you, dear. I do love roses. They're my absolute favourite flowers." "Mrs. Burberry." "Oh, please, dear," said the old woman, waving her frail hand in the air. "Don't call me that name. I'm Francine." "Well, Francine, I heard about the robbery, and I'm so desperately sorry about what happened to you." The old woman looked at me, her eyes filling with tears. "That man," she said, shaking her head woefully. "He was so evil. He left me for dead, you know, stabbed me in the chest, missed my heart, took all my life savings." "I know, Francine, and I'm really sorry." "Why are you sorry, dear? It's kind of you to say so, but it's not your fault." "I'm sorry that there are people in the world capable of such evil. That's what I'm saying." "Well, I hope he rots in hell for what he did," she said, apologizing for her outburst. "Don't apologize. But he's dead, so you don't have to worry about him any more." "What?" she asked. "But how do you know, dear?" "My friend ran him over in the road by mistake. We didn't want him to get into trouble, so we secretly buried your attacker's body in the woods, but we found your money in his duffel bag, and I've got it here for you." "You've got my money?" she asked. "All of it. All of it." "And you promise me that the monster is dead?" "I promise you," I said. "Well, please, keep my money for me, dear, won't you? Until I'm out of hospital. I couldn't bear for it to get stolen again." "Dear Lord, my prayers have been answered. I don't know how to thank you enough. I can hardly believe this. I'm so sorry, dear. I know it's horrible to say, but I'm so glad he's dead. I now know I can sleep safely at night. Don't you worry. Your secret is safe with me. You tell your friend that he's given an old lady some comfort." To cut a long story short, I did learn that the police finally removed Rebel's body from the woods, and my prediction was absolutely right. When his body was cremated, his mother never ever came to pick up his ashes, but someone had to volunteer to throw them in a pretty place for the man. In truth, it would probably have been better if he had remained undisturbed in the woods. I don't think that Ken was ever quite the same after running over Rebel in the road. He did go and confess his sins to a Catholic priest, I was told, who assured him it would be folly to go to the police. "It was an accident. You've already been incarcerated by your guilt, young man. If you ask me, the man got what he deserved. Do yourself a big favour and make the most of your life from now on. Don't let the man who took so much from others steal your joy. But make bloody sure you never drink and drive again. You were lucky. It was a bad man you killed." I think the priest's reassuring words brought Ken a measure of comfort, but he still struggles to forgive himself and is constantly telling people never to drink and drive. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.